Friday the 13th is one of the biggest names in horror, especially the slasher subgenre, so it is somewhat hard to imagine, especially for maybe who's a bit younger, what it could have been like before the series came out, because of course the series has gone up to 10 main series films. It's got the Freddy vs. Jason and even the reboot, so that's 12 films total. Be a lot cooler if they had 13. You can make a funny joke about that. Whatever. There's some lawsuit going on, so they can't make another. Let's move on. But yeah, Friday the 13th is a massive franchise even. And this has led to it being parodied or referenced or even ripped off and homaged. And yeah, it's a very successful series, so it is really hard to imagine that it just wasn't around one day. Anyone who has seen the film should be aware that it is a very low budget production, and is actually quite amazing to me how much they managed to do. I believe they got a $500,000 budget, which, I mean, I'd like that, you know. I think we'd all like that. But as far as filmmaking goes, that is a very small scale budget, and even though the film is a bit rough around the edges, some of the effects look maybe a slight bit dated in these days, but for the time it was actually groundbreaking. Like the effects of slitting one of the actresses' necks. Sure, it's been redone 100 times since, so not even 100, a million times since. But for the time, they were really doing these things for the first time. It's like a latex, and it's a slit, and the actress pulls her head backwards, and that's how it reveals the slit. That's how it looks like her neck's been cut on screen. So the creators of this were being very innovative in their approach, and there is actually quite an interesting story of how the film even came to be in the first place, which is that they didn't even have a script or even really a concept of what the film would be, and they already put out a poster in a Variety magazine sort of advertising the film before they'd made a script or anything. And this might sound a little bit odd, but just at a base level, if you think about it, these days a lot of film companies are still doing this. We know all the Marvel films for the next 5 years or so. DC's announced countless films, although whether or not they'll actually happen is questionable because they keep going in different directions. And so yeah, there is precedent for this. This isn't the only film that has advertised itself a long time before pre-production even starts. This does happen. However, there is a bit more of a shock that because it was the first film, it's not them announcing a sequel to something. It was its own original concept, although it is, of course, heavily inspired by Halloween. Friday the 13th was created by one Sean S. Cunningham. He was the director of the original film. He also produced it. He hasn't had quite as much involvement in the series since. He produced maybe Jason Goes to Hell. He's produced them, but as far as directing goes, he only stayed with the original film. And what are his origins? Well, he started off actually in the softcore pornography business. He directed a film called The Art of Marriage, and yeah, so this was like a white lab coat film, I believe the subgenre was called, and the guy comes out and says, oh, this is how people have sex, and then they show you sex, because they didn't want to be like arrested for saying, you know, it's pornography. No, they're getting away with it by saying, oh, it's medical, it's a educational film. It's telling you, I guess, like a sex education. So his first film credit is in the 1970 film The Art of Marriage. Later, a slightly bigger or more well-known production he did was in 1972, The Last House on the Left, which has of course been remade in 2009, I believe. And this film, he was just a producer, so he actually isn't too interested in the horror genre, even though some of his most famous works are horror. So he actually called his friend over to direct it. His friend is none other than Wes Craven, who you might know from going on to direct big slasher films like Nightmare on Elm Street, New Nightmare, and even the first 4 Scream films. And then in 1978, he went back into the film industry, directing 2 kids' films, one titled Here Come the Tigers, another titled Manny's Orphans. And this is the genre he wanted to actually work in. He even wanted, after these 2 films, to go into doing a children's TV series. But of course, as we all know, it's the reason you clicked on this video, it's on my shirt here, everyone's heard of this franchise. That didn't quite pan out. He, sort of out of having no other options, horror seemed to call to him. And this time, in 1978 as well, a film by John Carpenter came out called Halloween. So Sean Cunningham and the screenwriter Victor Miller, they came up with an idea to sort of rip off Halloween, and not literally rip it off because it is somewhat different, but take pretty much the main basic story beats of Halloween and make their own film and call it Friday the 13th. They both loved this title idea, so they wanted to know if they could make something with it. So what they did was they released an advert in Variety magazine on the 4th of July, because that's obviously quite a big time, so a lot of people would be looking at this magazine. So their idea was, if they couldn't get the rights to release this film with that name, somebody would call them up and go, "Yo, you can't make this film. I own the rights to the words Friday the 13th." And of course, as you can see, they ended up with the rights. There's actually 2 stories out there. The one that Sean Cunningham is releasing is saying just nobody called up, so they made the film. There is another story out there that there was a film called Friday the 13th, The Orphan, and people believe that they came to a settlement, so I'm not sure which of the 2 stories there is actually true. This advert served 2 purposes. One is, of course, as I said, to see if they would get sued for using that name, and the other was to drum up interest in the film. It was even they went to somebody with the idea before putting this advert out, and they weren't interested in the film. And then, after they put this advert out, they wanted to give up the money. It's almost a surprise because the advert doesn't even show too much. It just says, this is a really scary movie. It's got text, a title saying Friday the 13th, and that it's by Sean Cunningham. That's about it that you've got on the poster, but it worked, so what do I know? So as I said, they did take a lot of inspiration from the Halloween film, and Halloween is a film about a serial killer going after a group of teenagers, and Friday the 13th is also that basic plot. But there's even more story beats that it does hit that are similar, because Halloween opens with a point of view shot, and it's a long point of view take. It's really good actually. And at the end it reveals that the killer is a little boy, Michael Myers. And then Friday the 13th in its opening scene is also set before the rest of the movie, and it also contains a lot of POV. So there's little homages like that. There's also both films have like one, I guess, big name actor or actress, and in Halloween that role is by Donald Pleasance. He plays like the helping character. He helps out with saving Laurie Strode. He helps sort of take down Michael Myers. So they had the idea to recreate this with Betsy Palmer, who shows up as Mrs. Voorhees. And at this point, you don't actually know who the killer is. And these days, because it's such a famous movie, you can work it out. But at the time, you see this sort of helpful lady come up, and it's a semi-well-known actress. She's always been done in a good light. She's never done horror before, and no surprise, she is a villain. She's the one doing the killing, and that's where I think this film succeeds a lot. And as I said, it is a bit rough around the edges. I do see its flaws, but I still think it is a good film. It's got some very negative reviews, but it is a great case study of how to make something out of nothing, and even how to start a franchise without meaning to. They had no plans of continuing the series, and then they ended up with 12 films. So if that's not a good job, what is? Yeah, the main thing that the film does succeed at, and a lot of people have called this cheesy or whatever, but I really commend it. I think it's done a great job at subverting expectations and managing to have surprises. These days, because so many films and TV shows have ripped it off, they are less surprising because you've seen it done. But for the time, these other films didn't exist, so you can't count them. That's something copying it. And yes, there's lots of scenes like this. There's the scene with Kevin Bacon. He's with this lady. They're doing stuff, and the camera pans up, and there's a dead body above them, and there's so much focus above them. And then the lady goes off, and the generic thing to happen would be she goes off and get killed. He goes to investigate, but no, it's Kevin Bacon who's the victim. And not only this little twist there that it's not the person you might expect it to be. It's also because there is the dead body above them, you're focusing above, but instead the killer's actually beneath and he gets poked through with the arrow. It's not genius, but for a slasher film, good job. And even, as I said, the Betsy Palmer casting against type, how she's supposed to be this nice, helpful, friendly old lady, but then it turns out she is the killer. And also, this wasn't intended, but because in the later films Jason comes into it as the killer, modern day audiences can also have their expectations subverted because so many people assume that it would be Jason because that's the villain of the franchise. But no, it's not him, it's someone you don't expect it to be. So that way, they didn't even write that surprise twist in, but it's becoming a twist in modern day. It's even referenced in the first Scream film. What are you doing?
I just realized your top is a body. It's a body.
Yeah.
I just realized. I'm like, that's a weird shape for a picture of a forest and lake. It's a fucking body.
It's got a knife. It's got. How many times have you seen this poster? I wear this shirt all the time. And also at the end there is a another surprise in that the day's been saved. It's all happy. There's music playing that really suggests everything's fine. Even the police are showing up. It's all good. Everything that happened the day before is gone and done with. It's all calm. And then all of a sudden, Jason jumps out because Jason is a kid who drowned and they're going over the lake. Jason jumps out. And I'm not really a fan of jump scares, but for jump scares, I think that's a good one. That is one of my positive examples of a good jump scare. Of course, because this one was good, so many people have copied it. It's in the new American Horror Story season. It's in a bunch of other films. But this was one of the first examples of it. Other than the film that inspired it, actually, was Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie. At the end of Carrie, you have a very similar scene where you're at a grave, it's really peaceful, and then a hand pops out, it's a surprise, and then you wake up and it was maybe a dream, but was it? And you can see there's clear similarities there, that is where they're inspired from, but it still works. It's still a decent ending. So overall, that is how the Friday the 13th franchise came to be, and I'm glad it all worked out for them, because everything was against them. They were making a film on pretty much nothing. The director didn't even really want to make the film, other than to feed his family. He didn't really want to make horror. He wanted to do kids stuff, but he decided he had to, and it's made a series that countless people love. It made one of the most iconic horror movie monsters, Jason Voorhees. So they did a good job.